Karoline Leavitt was due in court at 9 a.m. At noon, she was en route to Zurich by plane, with a trail of unanswered questions, frozen funds, and an aghast courtroom left to mutter itself into shock. What occurred between those two moments? Let's examine this further. It all began when Leavitt forgot something as mundane as a name. At 8:33 a.m., within the U.S. District Court in downtown San Diego, the clerk had just announced Karoline Leavitt's name, anticipating a prompt presence for a deposition related to rapper Jasmine Crockett's $80 million lawsuit. But the answer was far from anticipated. "Not present, Your Honor," a junior associate muttered, catching everyone by surprise. A ripple of looks swept the room. The judge just sat in stunned silence, looking over his glasses, expecting an explanation. As the courtroom began to whisper, outside in the courtyard of the courthouse, there were already gathered media vans hoping for a few words from Leavitt following the hearing. And yet, no one appeared. No vehicle, no social media posting, anything. Then the first rumor. A TSA worker at JFK had messaged a political blogger. "Think I just saw Karoline Leavitt get on a flight to Zurich. The name was off, but it was her." Folks didn't have any idea what to do with that. Not yet, at least. At 10 a.m., a blurry photo started to spread around. It was of a woman in dark glasses, navy blazer, lugging a carry-on by gate 14 at JFK's Terminal 7. Her demeanor was rigid, but she wasn't frantic. No grin. A second photo came, of her talking to a man in a black hoodie. No one known, but the timestamp confirmed. By lunchtime, word arrived from an insider within a regional police department. Leavitt had utilized a diplomatic connection to get on the plane under an alternate name, private clearance. Inside the courtroom, the judge glanced at the image that had been handed to him. "If this is verified," he said, "we're shifting course." Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett, the woman at the center of the lawsuit, sat perfectly still. Her lawyer leaned over and whispered something to her, but she didn't respond. Her hands remained locked in her lap. Outside, the sidewalk filled with reporters, microphones in every direction. Headlines were shifting quickly. What had once been a court battle between Leavitt and Crockett was now a headline. Karoline Leavitt runs from deposition. But this wasn't a viral PR stunt. This was federal court, and people were starting to know what was at stake. Reed Bowen, a local reporter who'd covered Leavitt while she worked as a White House staffer, broadcast live on his own channel. "I knew she was tough, but this? I never thought I'd see this. If she actually skipped court and fled the country, it's not terrible optics, it could be contempt." In the background, Crockett's staff was already on the move. Motions to freeze assets were being prepared, federal liaison officers were being notified, and the Office of International Judicial Assistance was called. The Hague Convention was set to come into play. At 4:46 p.m., another source confirmed the flight had landed in Zurich and Leavitt had cleared customs alone. The day that started with a skip deposition ended with headlines questioning whether a former White House aide had dodged federal proceedings by crossing the Atlantic. But why did this lawsuit matter so much? Why was Karoline Leavitt tied to an $80 million case that suddenly became so explosive? The $80 million wasn't a bluff. It was the result of months of behind-the-scenes internal math, expert opinions, and legal strategy sessions. Representative Jasmine Crockett wasn't bluffing when she sued. Anyone who read the first 30 pages of the complaint would realize that it wasn't merely a complaint of defamation. It was backed by layers of accusations of civil conspiracy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and a seldom applied accusation of malicious coordination of misinformation directed against a federal official under fiscal audit. It all dated back to a critical stretch of Crockett's first congressional term, January to April. A string of anonymously reported news stories came out, implying she had abused campaign contributions. They went viral quickly, with the help of social media, podcasts, and videos. But the rumor mill had done its work well before the audit found nothing material. Weeks passed, and Crockett remained silent, but her mind was made up. One of her veteran assistants remembered the day Crockett said, We have to go after the people who think they can lie and get away with it. By a methodical search, Crockett's staff followed a trail of multiple tails to a media relations company in Arizona, which had some connection, albeit indirect, to a super PAC previously associated with Leavitt's firm. But the breakthrough occurred when an email leak became public. The emails referenced Crockett by name and spoke about advancing bad optics in the course of the audit. The author ended the initials KL. That alone wouldn't have stood in court, but it wasn't alone. A subpoena of the bank transfers of the consultancy revealed a single payment from a private donor group connected to Leavitt's former employer. The payment correlated to a suspicious invoice from the PR firm, which was dated a mere week before the smear stories began. By then, Crockett's lawyers were certain that it was no accident. There was a concerted campaign to destroy her credibility at a time of weakness, and they suspected Karoline Leavitt was behind it. The formal lawsuit came in April, and things stopped. Leavitt's publicist made a short statement, but then nothing happened. No counterfiling, no dismissal request. Silence. The case quietly rested in pretrial preparation for the next few weeks until the court signed off on an expedited timetable after evidence authentication. The previously under-the-radar lawsuit suddenly was all anyone was discussing in Washington, D.C. It wasn't merely a lawsuit anymore. It was a moment. A veteran employee of a Baltimore think tank summed it up starkly. There's a difference between playing politics and attempting to destroy someone's reputation during a federal audit. If what Crockett's people are saying is accurate, this wasn't just mudslinging. This was strategic sabotage. But what precisely were the charges made against Leavitt? How extensive was the alleged web of planted stories and online manipulation, actually? On the surface, the smear campaign appeared to be a string of poorly reporting conspiracy websites. But the more Crockett's lawyers researched, the more everything began to appear calculated. One article alleged that Crockett had used campaign money to purchase furniture for her apartment in Washington, D.C. Absolutely untrue. Another said that she had associations with a consulting group run by her cousin. Again, untrue. A third insinuated that she had not reported thousands in contributions from PACs, once more made up. The tales weren't intended to make news. They were created to spread just enough to seed doubt, and once those rumors set in, they remained there. Crockett's lawyers hired an outside digital intelligence company to trace the domains of two blogs back to an IP block belonging to a media contractor that was once associated with Leavitt's consultancy. The trail was sloppy but discernible, akin to tracing scuffed footprints along a rainy sidewalk. But the path existed. Then dropped the bombshell. Two confidential witnesses, one a past assistant to the Arizona PR agency, the other an independent who did paid content campaigns, testified under sealed depositions. Both testified about the same alias, Katie Lee. Katie Lee did not have any official records, but these witnesses recognized her as being the final approver for the stories. There was even a memory of a video call with her, recalling the voice to be sharp, youthful, and East Coast. In the court filing, Crockett's team contended that Katie Lee was an alias meant to cover for Karoline Leavitt, but enabled direct control over when and how the fabricated narratives were released. They also hinted at coordination with burner Twitter accounts, all traced back to Leavitt's consultancy. And then the actual surprise, a $22,000 wire payment from a Shell LLC in Nevada to the PR company. The memo stated Q1 media push, and it came a week before the largest hit piece on Crockett came online. Crockett's staff wasn't constructing a case of defamation. They were constructing a map, and each line led back to Leavitt's ring. The question now wasn't one of whether Leavitt was implicated. It was how extensive her reach had been. Karoline Leavitt coordinated the whole thing, authorizing budgets, writing stories, employing cover names, and keeping far enough away to claim innocence if it all fell apart. But the truth had started to disintegrate. One of the most unnerving moments was delivered in a statement by Jasmine Crockett herself. "If I make an error, I accept responsibility. But when someone takes months to tear you down with falsehoods, particularly when you're being reviewed by your own government, then it's no longer politics, it's targeted harm." The court consented to progress the case on the basis of the trend of indirect attribution and provable harm. But in order to fully understand how this case blew up, we need to get both sides of the story from Crockett's, the woman whose career, name, and sanity were put on the line abruptly. Jasmine Crockett didn't make a dramatic entrance with splashy headlines and viral moments. She arrived in Congress the hard way, door to door, community town halls, and late nights of listening to people's anxieties in crowded auditoriums. Her strength was not in sound bites, it was in appearing, even when there were no cameras present. So when the tales began spreading, she did not panic. Not initially. She believed people would see through the falsehoods. She believed the truth would catch up, but it did not. Not quick enough. The first indication something had changed occurred at a fundraising dinner in Dallas. An old donor took her aside, gripping her hand a bit too tightly, and said, "I want to believe in you, Jasmine. I really do, but I don't want to see your name on the evening news again." That stuck with her. She sat on the edge of her hotel bed that night, phone in hand, reading Twitter mentions. She knew she shouldn't, but she'd had a call earlier from her mother with the message, "Ignore the noise. Just do your work." But even her mother was inquiring about the articles. "I didn't cry," Jasmine explained to a staffer later. "I just felt this weird pressure in my chest, as if I had to justify myself to people I never even met." Back in her D.C. office, the mood shifted. Junior staff started hedging on press releases. One even asked if they should delay public events until the audit was resolved. Her chief of staff, Nolan Reese, shut that down immediately. "We're not going underground." She didn't do anything wrong. But the air was heavy, like someone had let a slow leak of doubt inside the walls, and no one could plug it. Then came the audit report. Clean, no misuse, no red flags. Just a footnote correction on a filing date. It should have put everything to rest, but by then, people had already made up their minds. One staff member referred to it as a fog of accusation, the sort that clings to you even when you enter a room with nothing to hide. Crockett attempted to put it behind her. She continued to work, holding hearings, moving bills through. But in the recesses of her mind, she couldn't drop it, not because it wounded her ego, but because it seemed like someone had attempted to wipe out her name before she'd even established her complete legacy. So she appealed for assistance. Her old friend, Layla Patterson, a retired civil rights lawyer, flew in for a weekend. They sat in Jasmine's apartment, munching on takeout, watching a documentary that neither of them noticed. "What if I just dropped it?" Jasmine asked. Layla stretched back against the couch and replied, "And what would that teach the next woman who gets pulled just because she's visible?" That silence is effective. That was the meeting that changed everything. In days, Crockett's group had secretly brought on a research company. In weeks, the legal machinery was in motion, but it wasn't revenge that she sought. It was truth. "I don't need her to break," Jasmine said of Leavitt in an off-the-record meeting. "I just need the record to reflect what really happened. I need people to know that this wasn't some mishap." Even as the suit proceeded, Crockett continued to appear. She didn't speak about the case to the media, didn't send out cryptic tweets. She dressed in her usual plain suits and kept appointments on time. But friends saw a change in her demeanor. She was just as collected but more acidic, less tolerant of interruptions, less inclined to smile over error. One instance was particularly memorable to Nolan Reese. They were video chatting with leaders in the community from East Texas, and they asked about political harmony. Jasmine hesitated, then responded, "I will collaborate with anyone who speaks the truth. But if you use lies as weapons, don't sit across from me like we're equal, because we're not." That line didn't go viral, but it landed heavy in every corner of that call. Behind the scenes, Crockett was still wrestling with the gravity of what had occurred, not to her, necessarily, but to the integrity of the office she occupied. She'd always been a believer in process. Now she was a believer in consequences as well. But as she remained vigilant and present, Karoline Leavitt was already taking a step nobody foresaw. At 6 a.m. on Tuesday, a woman in navy blue blazer, skinny black pants, and a beige carry-on bag wheeled her suitcase by the British Airways desk at JFK's Terminal 7. She had oversized sunglasses and moved purposefully, quick but calm. The only reason anyone ever noticed her was because she wasn't where she wasn't supposed to be. Not that day. Not there. Karoline Leavitt had a court deposition to give in San Diego. She wasn't on the no-fly list. She hadn't committed a crime. The plan was straightforward. Arrive, take a seat, and respond to questions. Instead, she evaporated into the sea of humanity at one of the world's busiest airports. It wasn't until a supervisor at an airline flagged her ID, which was listed under a variation of her middle and last name, that things began to feel suspicious. The name listed on the manifest wasn't Karoline Leavitt, but it was close enough to make eyebrows rise, particularly for someone who had worked in political security. The flight was to depart at 8 a.m., and everything about that checked out. But their supervisor, who would later comment off the record, reported that the woman did not appear to be afraid, only intensely concentrated, like a person entering a meeting she'd practiced 100 times. Meanwhile, a baggage handler snapped a picture. He wasn't attempting to photograph Leavitt, but was simply recording the unusually large number of upscale bags being loaded for the flight. In the corner of one photo, there she was, turned head slightly, sunglasses wearing, striding down toward the jet bridge. The timestamp coincided with the security log. By 9 a.m., that picture had been sent to a reporter in Washington, D.C. She didn't run the story right away. Initially, she thought it was a mistake. But then a second source chimed in, a TSA officer who had handled a pre-check scan for a high-profile individual flying under secondary credentials. He didn't name her, but he didn't have to. At 10 a.m., the news broke on Twitter. Breaking, Karoline Leavitt might just have gotten on a flight to Zurich. Her deposition was set for today and CA. What's happening? It wasn't conclusive, but it took off like wildfire. By lunchtime, screenshots of the photo were being shared in political group texts throughout D.C., Dallas, and Sacramento. Newsrooms were abuzz. One journalist at the airport reported confirmation that the jet had left at 8 a.m., a minute or two behind schedule. At 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, a second leak. A Leavitt aide, Ben Schreckinger, close to the X campaign, sent over a text he had gotten the night before late, "I'll be off the grid for a few. Don't let the headlines spin you. Truth takes longer than gossip. No location tag. No context." Just that, as if damage control had already started before the damage had even hit. Meanwhile, in the San Diego courthouse, Karoline Leavitt's failure to appear was properly noted. Her lawyers were as taciturn as ever. Lead counsel Silas Benton simply told the judge, "We'll respond in writing." The judge was in no uncertainty. He ordered immediate confirmation of where she was through federal channels. In a matter of hours, Crockett's attorneys had made an emergency motion to freeze Leavitt's identified funds, bank accounts, properties, consulting interests, all that could be tracked. It wasn't an arrest, and it wasn't even a criminal search. But it communicated something. Flying overseas didn't mean you're off the case. At JFK, one of the customs officers who had momentarily watched Leavitt pass through clearance said she didn't appear upset. She looked like she'd done it all before, like she was used to people not asking her questions. She boarded, she flew, she landed. Zurich arrival was confirmed at 9:05 local time. She passed through immigration on the same alternate credentials, unaccompanied, no handlers, no entourage, just Karoline, a carry-on, and a document folder under her arm. The cameras did not catch her on the floor. She disappeared into the crowd again, as smoothly as she had in New York. But her sudden exit created a void. And in that silence, the courtroom reacted in subdued intensity, ushering in a new chapter no one had quite expected. In San Diego, word of Leavitt's flight reached the courtroom ahead of some of the clerks. The judge had just concluded a side motion hearing when his clerk quietly handed him a copy of the fuzzy airport photo. He glanced at it for a moment, pushed his glasses up to the top of his nose, and leaned forward onto his microphone. "Let the record show that Miss Leavitt is not present, and there are developing indications that she has left the United States in the past 24 hours. That wasn't a note for the file. That was the court officially acknowledging that something had changed. Jasmine Crockett sat next to her attorney, arms crossed but serene. No outburst, just a little intake of breath, measured, steady, like someone who already knew what she was about to discover. Leavitt's attorney, Silas Benton, did not object to the course of events. He simply asked for some time to verify the location of his client. But the judge was not inclined to give much time. "We're not speculating," he said to Benton, "but if she's out of the country and no notice was given to the court, then we have a procedure problem. And if it's contemptuous, we're on the edge of contempt." While the words of the law were comforting, tension existed down the corridor from the courtroom. Speculation was making its way through the interns and junior lawyers, speculating as to why Leavitt would be departing. Was it strategy? Was it fear? Or was it arrogance? In their offices, meanwhile, Crockett's staff moved swiftly. They filed an emergency motion to freeze Leavitt's liquid assets and limit any further transfers from the principal account of her consulting firm. At 2:45 p.m., the motion had already been transmitted to financial compliance offices across Texas, Utah, and Florida, states where Leavitt had operated over the past few years. The case now operated on connections, patterns, and trails, the legal equivalent of following footprints along a thin layer of dust, evidence that's not loud but not silent either. In the West Coast Liaison, Horenitens er Brackmundvis Mind Sex Liaison. In the West Coast Liaison, Josh's Lanes, Vesatone West Coast Liaison. So for Besitsnessy Vescons in the West Coast Liaison, the Toldesitionly West Coast Liaison. In Tistosalis Assistuslis for Societas Porcelize and Tiscuslicitovi. Office of the Department of Justice, a request form was being drawn up, ready to move on to the next level, to invoke judicial assistance in accordance with the Hague Convention. Unprecedented, certainly in a civil case, but the judge had indicated the Leavitt no-show had set the tone. This was no longer a political disagreement. This was a budding legal crisis. Crockett, however, refused to talk to the press. She climbed into a black SUV after the hearing and was out of view in a matter of minutes. But her attorney, Nadine Evers, stayed on for a second at the top of the courthouse steps. When asked if they believed that Leavitt had departed intentionally, Evers refused to be provoked. "We're not in the drama business," she replied brusquely. "We're in the accountability business." Back in court, a court reporter scribbled. It was subtle, but the wheels of the legal machine were tightening. Quiet consequences. There were no dramatics, no headlines screaming across marble floors. Only deadlines, motions, certified timestamps, quiet documents doing the hard grunt work. Down the corridor, a paralegal with a backpack muttered, "I don't think anyone thought she'd actually go." Another said, "That's because they underestimated how far one will run to escape saying something on the stand." By evening, an internal memo went out to all the legal teams involved in the case. International coordination would be forthcoming. There would be no hesitation to wait and see if Leavitt would voluntarily come back. The next court date was the following week, but the tone had already shifted. What had been a staid process now hummed with urgency just below the surface. The judge made one final comment before adjourning. "If the court finds that the defendant has willfully left the country to avoid appearance, we will move under all applicable statutes. Intent will be a factor. Purpose. That one word was the focus of the case. But while the wheels of justice spun into high gear, something else was afoot. Silence. No tweet, no press release, no lawyer hanging outside the courthouse making apologies. Just mounting, intentional silence from Leavitt's staff. By Wednesday morning, the silence had reached a breaking point. Not a sound from her staff. No press release, no tweet, no denial, no correction. For a person who had once survived on media attention, someone who had mastered the art of writing headlines and generating buzz, this kind of silence did not just appear unusual, it appeared deliberate. Reporters clogged inboxes, called known aides, and reached out to former aides. Nothing. Some phone numbers were no longer in service. One of Leavitt's former assistants, who had once managed his press scheduling, replied to a text with 2 words, "Not involved." Her site stayed the same. No news, no comments. A static homepage with her photo and boilerplate mission statement. Her publicity department in her consultancy simply took down the media inquiries link out of there quietly. A Tampa local affiliate attempted to call Leavitt's attorney, Silas Benton. He curtly replied, "I don't have a comment at this time. When I do, I'll make sure it's with the court first," before he hung up the phone on them. The media interpreted that as a sign. Leavitt's legal approach had changed. Perhaps her priorities had, too. But the quiet did not discourage the digging. One of Leavitt's former interns, Megan Estevez, who had worked for Leavitt on her unsuccessful congressional bid 2 years earlier, shared her story anonymously with a freelance writer. She recalled the last time she ever laid eyes on Karoline in person, just 5 days before the deposition was scheduled. She was distracted, not nervous, but like her mind was somewhere else, Megan said. She didn't make much eye contact. She kept glancing at her phone. When she left that afternoon, she said, "No matter what happens next, stay fixed on your own course." Megan had assumed it was campaign-related, but now she wasn't so sure. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Rumors were circulated through several media circles. One said Leavitt had emptied a Dallas storage unit last week. Another said her calendar had been erased from a group scheduling application that her former colleagues used. Most were unverifiable, but the quick erasure of web traces only fueled the rumors. Political analyst Angela Beaufort, who had known Leavitt at the beginning of the 2020 cycle, made a quiet observation on a live panel. She always knew how to manage the narrative. If she's not speaking out now, it's not that she doesn't have something to say. It's that she doesn't want it said out loud. In Crockett's world, the hush was no surprise. It was infuriating. "It's not even about the lawsuit anymore," griped one aide. "It's about respect. If you get charged with something and you know you're innocent, you fight. You don't disappear." At the same time, reporters researched Leavitt's recent actions. One reported she hadn't made a single monetary donation or financial transaction through her LLC in more than 10 days. Another highlighted a withdrawn request for a Nevada business license. It was an insignificant detail, but it was suspicious timing. One of the more thoughtful postings was from a person we hadn't seen in a while, Daniel Shen, a policy analyst who had worked on Leavitt's consulting work earlier. He posted a blog entry entitled "When Silence Screams." He described a phenomenon he'd noticed earlier, powerful people keeping their mouths shut, not because they're not sure, but because the words they would have to employ to explain themselves would do more harm than keeping quiet. It wasn't a defense and it wasn't accusation. It was a statement, and it hung in the air. In a coffee shop outside Union Station, 2 of Hill's aides huddled in a corner booth, sharing the same theory over iced lattes. "She's lawyered up, full lockdown. She's not gone for good, she's buying time." Perhaps, yet even among the politically jaded, the silence was not the same this time. Typically, when political figures find themselves in legal jeopardy, they fight back. Statements, media appearances, carefully crafted narratives of innocence. But this time, it didn't happen. It created a void, and people filled it with suspicion, speculation, and side conversation that said more than any press conference ever could.
And where words were insufficient, the machinery of the media kicked into high gear. By Thursday morning, the silence had threatened to break. When a former White House aide dodges a federal deposition and hops on a plane out of the country with no comment, the media does not stand idly by. It moves fast. All the heavy hitters scrambled to fill airtime. The facts were meager, but that hadn't stopped them. The moment was too raucous to be ignored. Morning talk show hosts parsed fuzzy airport photos, frame by frame. Cable news anchors toggled between legal experts and political commentators. No one was able to contact Karoline Leavitt, and that just fueled the rumor. Rumor substituted for missing information. On a 9 a.m. program, a right-wing host asked baldly, "What is the type of person who avoids court in the midst of a civil action that large? You don't run unless you have something to hide." A liberal commentator replied on another show, "She has been working in disinformation campaigns for decades. This is just another chapter out of her own playbook, except this time she is the one under the microscope." Videos from both went viral. Social media was worse. Tweets varied from snarky memes, Leavitt photoshopped into a Swiss Alps ski resort, to outrage threads accusing her of subverting legal accountability. Supporters tried to fight back, labeling the lawsuit as political theater, but were swamped by a tsunami of responses. One commented, "Karoline Leavitt didn't flinch when others were on the hot seat. Now it's her turn and she just vanishes. That's not strength, that's a pattern." It was liked 87,000 times at the end of the day. Podcasts spent entire shows covering the story. Some branded it an evasion. Others called it strategic withdrawal. But the consensus was this: no longer a case. It was a public reckoning. One show named their episode "The Ghost Candidate," a reference to how quickly Leavitt had moved from political newcomer to international question mark. In Washington, reporters began clustering outside Crockett's office. She still wouldn't comment, but her communications director sent out a brief statement by email. "Representative Crockett is committed to the legal process. We have faith in the courts to resolve this, and we will keep working to serve the people of Texas." It was the only word that emerged from her camp that day. No follow-ups, no interviews, only icy professionalism. The contrast only helped to fuel the story. Several editorial columns went with the same theme. One woman appears, the other disappears. In Austin, a small protest was organized by a local activist community in favor of Crockett, with "Truth Still Matters" and "We Stand with Jasmine" signs. It wasn't large, but it was reported locally, and it made a point. People weren't just watching. They were standing up for something. Meanwhile, at JFK, security officers were quietly queried by federal agents reviewing Leavitt's departure. No resistance, no arrests, just quiet documentation in the shadows. The police were building the timeline, minute by minute, even as the press made leaps each hour. A seasoned federal prosecutor openly declared on a TV show about law, "She's not charged. Not yet. But if she doesn't appear soon, that clock winds up very fast. The court will not stand to be ignored." This is not a campaign trail. This is law. On Twitter, the hashtags trended for hours. Hashtag "Where is Karoline?" Hashtag "Fleeing accountability." Hashtag "Justice for Crockett." But it was not all rhetoric, it was pressure. It started to sink in with political leaders. A few politicians made platitudes about how we must respect the rule of law, and others ducked the question. But one former congressional aide said something that caught my attention. "It's never about the disappearance itself. It's about what it exposes. The trust gaps, the silence, the people we put on pedestals, and the ones we ignore until they fight back." By the end of the day, Leavitt's name was mentioned on all the major political blogs, not for what she had said, but for what she had not said. The story had expanded beyond the lawsuit. It was now one of accountability, of ethics, of being held accountable when you've made a living out of playing with narratives. But as the news churned and the headlines piled up, the real effect of this moment was still striking hardest on the ones who had no cameras, no mic stands, only the emotional bruise of being caught in the middle of a battle that went far, far beyond the courtroom. Beyond the newsrooms, beyond the trending hashtags and the cable panel shows, there were people living this moment in quiet exhaustion. Not pundits, not politicians, just the ones who'd been up close to it all. Phones in Crockett's district office in Arlington, Texas, never quit ringing. Some of the callers called in support, some called in confusion, and some left angry voice mail messages berating her for trying to take down a young conservative woman for political gain. All of the staffers got turns answering the calls. No one screamed back. They just listened, took notes, and tried to be human in a job that demanded restraint. Lena Rowe, Crockett's staff assistant, was still working late. Her desk was littered with sticky notes and articles printed out, but her phone background was still the same. A photo of her son holding a campaign sign. For days had gone by since she'd last seen him. When she called home, he'd say, "Are you winning?" She never knew what to tell him. In the break room, Nolan Reese browsed an internal forum on his tablet, concern creeping into each post. A new intern had asked if it was still acceptable to wear Crockett's campaign button off campus. Another asked if she needed to remove a tweet from the last month that used the hashtag of the lawsuit. They weren't worried about the lawsuit. They were worried about the disruption, the harassment, the direct messages filling inboxes, the veiled threats disguised as questions. This case wasn't just in front of a judge and jury. It was seeping into everyday life. Back in D.C., meanwhile, at a small advocacy nonprofit where Crockett used to volunteer, Executive Director Simone Gardner was receiving around-the-clock media calls. Not for comment per se, but for a quote about Jasmine's personality. All of the reporters required a before to contrast with the now. Simone had none of that. "She's not a story arc," she told one of them. "She's a person. She didn't sign up to be lied about. She didn't train for this fight, but she's fighting it now. And she's fighting it the way she always does. Head up, eyes forward." In a West Side Fort Worth community center, a group of teenage girls completed their after-school leadership program when one of the teens asked, "Is Crockett going to quit?" "She won't," responded the mentor. "She doesn't know how." But though the anguish was most apparent around Crockett, it wasn't contained there. A young political columnist in Phoenix, who had freelanced before for one of the PR agencies targeted by the lawsuit, cried uncontrollably during an anonymous interview. "I had no idea what I was writing was part of something large. I thought I was merely writing hard-hitting stuff. It wasn't even my title. They provided me with the script. Now I feel like I contributed to hurting someone I didn't even know." Another ex-employee from the same company, who had left several months prior, quietly confided in a friend, "I'm afraid someone's gonna knock on my door and ask me what I knew. Because the truth is, I knew enough." Even Crockett's mom, a retired elementary school teacher, had begun to steer clear of local news. Every time she saw her daughter's face on television, it was like a fresh bruise. She phoned Jasmine late one evening, crying out, "Are you okay?" even when you're smiling for the cameras. Jasmine's response was straightforward. "I don't need to be okay right now. I just need to be honest." Honesty was the only armor remaining. The pressure on her crew was so immense. No sleep, no room for mistakes, no over-the-top tirades, just pure perseverance. Under the spotlight of public attention, they were not just fighting a lawsuit, they were fighting for their faith that truth still existed, even when it got buried beneath noise. Meanwhile, the lawsuit gradually awakened people who hadn't ever listened before. A team of young law students in Sacramento started a weekly newsletter breaking down the case in simple words. A retired Oklahoma judge blogged on the value of witness credibility. They were small waves, but actual waves. Everyone had their own story, but the people nearest to the mess had something more. The burden of recognizing the man behind the headlines. Understanding what it is like to work your entire life for something, then just see it challenged by someone who never even made eye contact with you. But as the emotional toll spread, and the harm still lingered in hidden corners, there remained one question. What is the lesson that remains when the headlines disappear and the cameras move on? When the din subsided slightly, you could at last pick up on what wasn't being said. No public outcries, no apologies, no assertions of innocence or culpability. Silence. Headlines growing stale by the hour, and others still awaiting someone to make sense of what had just occurred. This wasn't about revenge for Jasmine Crockett. It was about clarity. She had played by the book. She endured an audit. She kept her head when rumors swelled louder than reality. And when it became evident that someone was controlling strings from the shadows, she decided to take action. Not with press releases or personal attacks, but with paperwork, strategy, and discipline. The truth didn't insulate her from the harm, but it provided her with guidance. One of her volunteers, a woman named Yvette with gray streaks running through her braids, put it best at a weekend food drive in Dallas. Sometimes the only way to win is not to break. That's what lingered with people. Crockett did not break. She did not reciprocate smear with smear. She remained where she was meant to be. There, working, arriving on time even when half the internet appeared hellbent on turning her into a villain. And Leavitt? She was still absent. Her silence could have been a legal strategy, a personal choice, or a strategic pause. Nobody really understood. But the more time went by, the more her absence was its own statement. its own kind of statement, the kind that fills in the blanks. One of the former campaign members of her congressional campaign remarked something which surprised many. She was always sharp, always 3 steps ahead, but never remained in one location for long. And when the pressure mounted, she did what she always did. She moved. Not everyone perceived her as guilty. Some thought the case was overblown. Some said that she was being made a political scapegoat. But even her supporters could not justify why she vanished without a word. Why she missed a deposition. Why, when accountability came knocking, she failed to even open the door. That's what individuals recall. Not the case specifics, not the online footprint, not the media coverage. They recall who attended and who didn't. And in that differentiation, something subtle and unmistakable started to emerge. When leadership is tested, individuals don't require perfection. They require presence. They want to see those they elected, the ones who blow loudly on podiums, sit when it counts most, answer tough questions, and take responsibility, even if it gets ugly, even if it hurts. Because ultimately, it's not about lawsuits or strategy memos. It's about the kind of person you are when nobody is applauding for you, when you and the truth and a chair with your name on it sit in a courtroom, and you choose whether you get in it. Jasmine Crockett sat, and despite all the commotion, all the pressure, all the questions, she just continued to show up. Perhaps the tale won't wrap up neatly. Perhaps there won't be some ultimate headline that will bring everybody closure. But something enduring was left in the midst of all this. A reminder that character isn't forged along the campaign trail. It's tested in moments like these. So whether you're in politics or not, remember what this moment showed. That silence can speak. That absence can wound. That showing up, even when it's hard, is a kind of power that no smear campaign can touch. And maybe that's the real story, not the lawsuit, not the flight, but the choice each person made when the pressure closed in. If this moment, for you, was something, if it was a reminder that truth, integrity, and being present still count, then don't let it slip away. Subscribe to more stories that dig deeper, and pass this on to someone who's sick of watching people sprint when things get tough.